When I was in college, oh, almost 50 years ago, I recall reading in my literature class about the so-called transcendentalists, Thoreau, Emerson, and others who had formed kind of a collective in the outskirts of the Boston area. And I tried to make sense of some of their writings, but quite frankly, most of it just seemed like words to me. I didn't have enough life experience to plug a meaning into the words that were there before me on the page. I recall reading about something they called an oversoul. And again, I really didn't understand what the whole thing was about. It was something that supposedly connected human beings. Each of us has or had a soul, an individual soul. But the oversoul was something like a connective tissue between each of the individual souls. And again, this didn't hold a whole lot of meaning to me until that life-changing experience after my freshman year in college, when I came home to Long Island and had my first date with Nancy McEwen. And the next morning, the bullet fired from a boat out on the bay traveled a course of almost a mile, came through the back window of Nancy McEwen's car, struck her behind the ear and killed her instantly. And suddenly I was acquainted with the shadow, and I started to get my mind around this concept of the oversoul. As far as the transcendentalists were concerned, I didn't really understand what they were transcending. Were they transcending life itself? And if so, what did that mean? But after that experience with Nancy McEwen and that bullet, suddenly I was acquainted with the other side in a very real way, and the concept of transcending life became quite real to me. And I started to see people around me in a different light. I started to plug into what I might call energy paths. I started to get a sense of certain people, and when they were real, and when they had plugged into something very, very powerful and genuine. And as I've traveled this path for the last 50 years, so many unexpected, wild twists and turns in my life, all kind of the you never know type things, I started to piece together things and started to get a sense as to what it is that that taps certain people in their lives, and in some cases calls them to play a role in history. I remember that I was living out here in the Marin Headlands, and I had pretty much run out of money, and I knew I had good credentials, you know, Harvard and Harvard Business School and work on Wall Street and so on. And so out of the blue I called one of the tech rags. There was this new thing called the internet, and I was intrigued about it. I sensed that there was something historic going on, and out of the blue I gave a cold call to the editor at a magazine called Upside. Now, as chance would have it, Upside was about to undergo an amazing transformation. The editor I spoke with was intrigued enough with my background to give me an assignment. It was kind of a test assignment, and I could kind of tell the way he was giving it to me. It was to go down and cover a startup that had just received $25 million of initial funding from two quite prestigious venture capital firms, Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia. And moreover, the most prominent venture capitalists at each of those firms had agreed to take a seat on the board of this company. And having been trained in journalism at Fortune magazine, where you had a month or two to work on a story, you would go out and you would try and see the light about these companies that you were going to be writing about. And so I called Cindy McCaffrey, who then was the head of communications at Google, and explained that I wanted to do an article. And so she sent me up. It was the first week in January, I believe, just after the turn of the millennium. And she blocked out an hour on the calendar of the two co-founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. I spent about an hour and a half with Sergey. Larry turned ill, and so we rescheduled it for a week or two later, and I spent another hour with him and an hour with Michael Moritz and John Doerr, Andy Bechtolsheim, Ram Shriram. All these people are today fixtures in the tech scene, billionaires many, many times over, and Google now provides the light to anybody who searches the internet. And I wrote a pretty positive story, not because I understood what this search technology was all about, just because I had a gut feel about these people that I had been speaking with. I sensed something. I don't know what it is. I sense not only intelligence, but a sense of history, a sense of perspective. And I remember Sergey telling me that he and the company were insanely focused on the technology. And in several hours of interviews with these guys, the only person who really had a sense as to how they were going to make money on the whole thing was Michael Moritz. And he didn't even have a very specific idea. He just said, you know, search is so fundamental that we're going to figure out a way to make money on it. They were plugged into the oversoul, I think. And I sensed this, and I wrote a very positive article about it and submitted it to my editor, and he threw it back at me, and he said, John, if you're going to write for Upside Magazine, you have to take a more skeptical tone. I was kind of taken aback. I really needed the money from the article. I felt the shadow emerging, and so I went for a long walk and decided that rather than challenge him, I would instead suggest that we make the article not just about Google, but the entire industry. And he went for that, and so I spent another month or two interviewing all the other competitors in the space and came up with a much longer article that paid me a lot more. And in the process, I had now immersed myself in this new world of tech. And so happens that just about this time there was a mutiny at Upside Magazine, and all the other editors got into a brouhaha with the chief editor. I don't know exactly what happened, but they all resigned or quit, or they were fired or something or other. And as they left, they erased all the hard drives. And so Jerry Burrell, who was the editor-in-chief, had these empty offices and empty computers, and he needed to get a magazine out the next month. So Jerry and I sat down and we said, okay, what we're going to do is create the first annual B2B article, business to business, which was the hot new area in the internet. And I ended up writing 12,000 words for that article, which paid me $12,000, and suddenly I was not only financially secure, but I now had stature within the tech world, and over the next several years interviewed hundreds of tech CEOs and really started to get a feel for this emerging industry. And more importantly, I started to get a feel for what it is that defines success and greatness in this industry, in any industry. And it comes back to this idea, I think, of the oversoul. Certain people are just plugged into a source. And I think for the great ones, that source often comes from nature. Steve Jobs, I'm told, would go for walks, long, long walks. And you see it with the others. And they were all part of a fairly close circle. There was this guy, a former football coach at Columbia, Bill Campbell, who became kind of the glue. They called him the coach, and he would help these young entrepreneurs plug into principles and a way of seeing the world that helped them through the rough spots, helped them deal with the shadows. Because in the final analysis, that's what determines whether or not we're going to succeed. Because the shadows are always there, and the question is how you're going to deal with them. The shadows are emerging today with all kinds of self-recriminations and self-analysis of the role of technology in our lives, and screen addictions, privacy concerns. These are the shadows that we have to deal with. But there's also the light. There's a bridge there off in the distance. A bridge that technology is building across cultures, across groups. And at the same time, there is these divisions, these walls, these fences that we're erecting between countries, between groups. And I think now more than ever, we need that oversoul. We need that vision, that sense of what it is that's going to enable us to bring the light into our lives, individually and collectively. And the more I reflect on this, the more I see the light reflecting there across the water and into my mind, the clearer it is to me that this oversoul, this bridge, this light, is the same thing that poets, philosophers, great artists, great entrepreneurs have all been talking about. It's the truth. We need to focus on the truth. And the truth includes the shadows. And it includes the light. And we need to integrate these.